Welcome back, vintage technology fans, and say hello to the Sony Cyber-shot P1, the first in a hugely popular series of impressively compact digital cameras. The P1 launched in September 2000, sporting a 3-megapixel sensor and a 3x optical zoom, which neatly folded flush inside the body when powered down. The P series was Sony really flexing its miniaturization skills, with the P1 essentially packing most of what everyone loved from the Cyber-shot S70, launched 6 months previously, into a body roughly half the size and lacking any unsightly protrusions. I originally tested the P1 over 2 decades ago for Mac User magazine, when it cost around $800 or about £600, and I remember at the time marvelling at its size. Fast forward to 2022 and I bought a second-hand P1 boxed and in good condition for £25 from eBay, and in this video I'll take it out around Brighton to see how it looks and feels 22 years after it was first launched. The P1 sported a unique shape and style, kinda like a chunky candy bar with a distinctive curved edge around the lens housing, and that became the signature of the series going forward. Much of the design DNA was clearly inherited from the earlier S70, seen here on the right, with the silver body featuring a thick blue stripe running along the top and with similar controls around it. The P1 body was almost the same width as the S70 and much the same thickness as the main part of that model too, but unlike the S70 it switched the fixed lens housing for an extendable one, allowing it to maintain the slimness when powered off. In fact, the lens folded neatly away to become essentially flush with the front surface, and the body was a good 15mm shorter too, giving it a much more compact appearance and more easily squeezing into pockets. Sony also sold an optional underwater housing for it. Now, you might assume the larger S70 would be more comfortable to hold, but the simple addition of a small scoop for your thumb on the back of the P1 not only allowed you to grip it more securely, but also avoided your thumb pushing against the zoom controls as it did when you held the S70. On the top of the camera, the P1 featured an LCD info screen, power slider, shutter release, and a similar 3-position modal to the S70, setting it between movies, stills, or playback. Annoyingly, like other Sonys of the day, the screen unhelpfully indicated the number of photos you'd taken, not the actual number you had remaining in your memory. So here the number 59 means I've taken 59 pictures, and the flashing icon means I'm running perilously low on memory, but without any firmer indication of exactly how many more I could take. Round the back is the same zoom rocker as the S70 in the top right corner, and much the same buttons too, although now positioned to the left of the screen rather than above it. Both cameras had 4-way joypad style thumb rockers, but the P1's felt less spongy to me and more positive. For composition, both the P1 and the S70 offered basic optical viewfinders, and while the P1's view through it is a little smaller, neither really allowed reliable framing, especially as you got to closer distances. For more accurate coverage, albeit still not 100%, you'll need to use the screen on the back, which like the S70 can be toggled on and off to save power using the LCD button. Even back in the year 2000, the P1 screen was pretty small at just 1.5 inches compared to the more generous 2-inch screen on the S70, but both panels actually shared the same 123K dot resolution, which meant the P1's displayed image and menus looked crisper. The backlight on my own S70 screen here is showing its age, but when comparing them side by side in 2022, the P1 screen was notably brighter and much easier to see in daylight. For connectivity, the P1 had a 3.5mm AV output on the side for those TV slideshows, along with a DC input and a USB port behind a flap on the back. So it may have lacked the flash sync socket of the S70, but by employing a more standard USB port, you're more likely to get it working today. In fact, I used my P1 as a USB memory stick reader. Yep, like other Sonys at the time, the P1 recorded its files onto the original, full-length, chewing gum style memory sticks, which slotted into the battery compartment behind a door on the flat side. At the time, most cameras were actually sold with memory cards to get you started, but Sony was more stingy than its rivals, bundling the P1 with a meager 8MB stick, which could only squeeze in around 5 best quality JPEGs. Meanwhile, the P1 was powered by the NP FS11 Info Lithium battery pack, which cleverly provided accurate feedback to the remaining life on screen. Like the S70, the battery was charged within the camera using a proprietary AC adapter, although the specs and connectors are different on both of these models. Sony quoted 70 minutes worth of recording on the P1 versus 110 from the larger FM50 battery housed within the S70, so that's an advantage for the bigger camera. But over 2 decades after they were born, none of these packs are likely to be holding any more charge, including, sadly, the one supplied with my second-hand camera. Luckily, modern replacements are still on sale, and I bought one from Subtel for a tenner. Thankfully, my P1 came with a working AC adapter, so I was able to charge this new battery inside the camera. It also meant I could use the P1 as a battery charger for an old Sony f505 camera, which shares the same pack but wouldn't allow it to be charged internally. And I'm going to be reviewing all of those Sony F-series cameras, so if you don't want to miss out, make sure you're subscribed. Okay, now for the lens, with the P1 offering a 3x range equivalent to 39 to 117mm and with an aperture of f2.8 to f5.6. The S70 also offered a 3x range, but started a tad wider at 34 to 102mm and more importantly with a much brighter aperture of f2 to 2.5. The S70 also offered closer focusing, full aperture and shutter priority, that's lacking from the P1, along with a small selection of preset manual focusing distance and prominent branding by Carl Zeiss. But the S70 was slower to power up, and despite owning one for several years, I frequently forgot to remove the lens cap, and that would force me to power it off and on again, which really slowed you down. In contrast, the P1 not only powered up faster, but its automatic lens cover was so much more convenient, and again the housing folded back neatly inside the body when powered off. Behind each lens was the same sensor, a 1/1.8 inch CCD with 3.3 megapixels, and that captures images with a maximum resolution of 2048 by 1536 pixels, or 15-second video clips at up to 320 by 240 at 15 frames per second. Pushing the control rocker upwards on either camera fires up the menu bar display, allowing you to set the self timer, choose from 4 picture effects, adjust the image quality and type, as well as manually adjusting the sharpness and the white balance, and the latter on the P1 offers indoor, outdoor, automatic or hold. Sony loved its tiny menus and fonts back in the day, made even smaller by the P1's 1.5 inch screen, and today I can barely read them without glasses. Like other Sonys at the time, you could choose lower image resolutions, but there was only one JPEG compression level, so if you wanted the full 3.3 megapixel quality, you'd be looking at files of around 1.4 megabytes each, which could quickly fill smaller memory sticks. If you wanted files even more unwieldy, you could set the P1 to record uncompressed TIFF files, not only tying up the camera for the best part of 30 seconds, but also unable to squeeze even a single one onto the supplied 8 megabyte card. Win-win. A monochrome option for document capture, as well as an animated GIF mode, were also available. With both cameras in my hands today, the big question for me was whether the Zeiss lens on the S70 really gave it noticeably better quality than the P1. So, here's a landscape shot that I took with both cameras side by side in 2022, and do remember they shared the same 3.3 megapixel sensor, so any differences are down to the lens and processing. Taking a close look at the details shows the S70 on the right, arguably resolving slightly finer detail, especially in the corners, but there's not a lot in it for a daytime shot with a distant focus. How about a portrait comparison at their maximum zooms? Looking beyond the slightly odd colours here, the S70 on the right has delivered a crisper image under these conditions, although while it also allowed me to select the much brighter maximum aperture, it's not actually made a huge difference in terms of background blur. Taking this to the extreme, here's a macro shot taken at the closest focusing distance of each camera, with their lenses set to wide and again using their maximum apertures of f2.8 for the P1 on the left and f2 for the S70 on the right. Looking closely shows neither lens has particularly attractive rendering, but the closer focusing and the brighter aperture of the S70 on the right is delivering a larger subject with greater blurring in the background. So the S70 really could capture better looking images in some situations, and with the benefit of more manual control too. But let's see how the P1 fares around town as a general purpose camera. See you in a minute.
could also film video in glorious 320 by 240 pixel resolution. That's quarter VGA, and for clips lasting up to 15 seconds each. Here's a few examples showing how it looks.
The Sony Cyber-shot P1 was certainly an exciting camera back in the year 2000, packing the latest 3-megapixel CCD sensor into a surprisingly compact body that also managed to house a 3x optical zoom that retracted inside. It was pretty groundbreaking at the time, and even 2 decades later it looks pretty advanced and still draws admiring glances from passers-by. The P1 proved tremendously popular, spawning multiple successors over half a decade, ending with the P200 in 2005. By this time though, Sony had several alternative solutions for compact cameras, including the ultra-thin T series, not to mention many in the S and W ranges getting pretty small too. But during its 5-year lifespan, the P series sold very well and found itself in the hands of many happy photographers. In fact, had the P1 been available when I originally bought my own S70, I think I'd probably have chosen it over the more sophisticated model. That compact body with a retracting lens and automatic cover was more useful to me in practice than having semi-manual control and fractionally sharper optics. So were you shooting with a P series back in the early noughties? I'd love to hear from you in the comments about your first digital cameras and what features convinced you to make the switch from film. If you enjoy these reviews of vintage cameras, please do check out my other videos here and consider subscribing to my channel to help me make more of them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.